A reading from Ruth, 2nd chapter, verses 2 through 9. And you can find this reading on page 239 in the Pew Bible. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain behind someone in whose sight I might find favor." She said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she went. She came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers. As it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Just then, Boaz came from Bethlehem. He said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." They answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his servant, who was in charge of the reapers, "To whom does this young woman belong?" The servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the Moabite who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers." So she came, and she had been on her feet from early this morning until now, without resting, even for a moment. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped, and follow behind them. I have ordered the young men not to bother you. If you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn." The word of the Lord.
Okay, girls, time for bed.
Oh, come on, we want a story. 3 sleepy kittens!
Oh no, sorry, that book was accidentally destroyed maliciously. Tonight, we are going to read a new book. This one is called One Big Unicorn. By who wrote this? Oh, me! I wrote it. Oh, look, it's a puppet book. Here, watch this. That's the one.
This is gonna be the best book ever.
Not to pat myself on the back, but yes, it probably will be. Here we go. One big unicorn, strong and free, thought he was happy as he could be. Then 3 little kittens came around and turned his whole life upside down.
Hey, that one looks like me.
No, what are you talking about? These are kittens. Any relation to persons living or dead is completely coincidental. They made him laugh. Ho ho! They made him cry. Oh. He never should have said goodbye. And now he knows he could never part from those 3 little kittens that changed his heart. The end. Okay, all right. Good night.
I love you.
I love you too.
Despicable Me. If you don't know that movie, I say about pretty much every movie I say, I was going to say, oh, you should watch the movie. It's really good. It is really good. It's if you don't know anything about it, this guy in the middle, his name is Gru, G-R-U, and he's a supervillain. And he's a caricature, if you will, of a supervillain. He's got all of the characteristics and attributes that you'd expect of a supervillain. And of course, he has the task that every supervillain on the planet has, and that is to steal something, to blow something up, or to take over the world, right? Because that's what supervillains do. And also, he has all of those, like I said, characteristics of a supervillain, and they are blown out of proportion in a movie like this. He is arrogant, he is prideful, and he is egotistical. and everything that comes with that supervillain characteristic. And what happens to lead up to that scene near the end, one part in particular is when he meets those kids and he actually tries to get rid of those kids. He's on his way to accomplishing whatever his plot is, and he runs across these 3 girls who are orphans, and he needs to use them in some way. And so he uses them and then wants to ditch them. He wants to get rid of them, and so he tries to drop them off at a theme park, because, of course, that's where you drop off all kids that you want to get rid of, right, is the theme park? Right? Unless it's Disneyland, then you want to go yourself too, but that's a different story. So he tries to shuffle them off and get rid of them at the theme park, but of course the theme park attendants say, no, you can't do that. You need to be there and supervise these kids. And so he's kind of stuck. He has to be at the theme park with those 3 girls. And so there's the scene sequence of him spending time with them, with these 3 girls at the theme park, and he starts to kind of like them. He starts to kind of like hanging out with them and starts to care for them a little bit, even to the point where there's one of those carnival game ride kind of things, and the carnival theme park people are kind of cheating one of the little girls out of the game, right? Just like, it's your typical carnival game. You throw the dart at the balloon and they just take your money because you can't really ever do it. You know what I'm talking about. Well, what would a supervillain do if one of these girls, one of their kids almost, is someone they care about, is being cheated out of a game? What would a superhero do? Blow up the game. That's right. That's what you do if you're a superhero. You just blow it up. Get rid of it. And of course, what the girls do is they don't say, well, that's not how you're supposed to act, or that's a part of that whole part of you, that supervillain part, that's not acceptable. You should shuffle that away, sweep that under the rug. They don't say anything like that. No, they say, well, you're pretty good at blowing things up, Gru. That's a talent that you've got. They accept him. They acknowledge the whole of who he is, not just the parts that society says are acceptable, but even the parts that are questionable are accepted by those girls. So next slide. Here we are in Lent, 3 weeks in, 3rd week of a sermon series on the book of Lent. And so before we kind of get going on this particular chapter that we're diving into today, I want to give just a real quick recap in case you're visiting, or in case maybe you missed 1, 2, or all or both of the Sundays leading up to this day in the sermon series. And so the first week was really about being an outsider. The first 3, 4, 5, 6 verses of the first chapter of the book of Ruth set us up to see Ruth and Naomi as outsiders. Next slide, please. You see, basically Naomi, who is from Bethlehem, she's one of the Hebrew people. There is a famine. Strike number 1. The perception is that God is somehow not favoring them. There's a famine in the land. God doesn't like us, or we did something wrong. So that's number 1. Number 2, she goes to Moab, of all places. It's like going to Ohio, right? It's the worst place you could go. Sorry. I'm starting to learn the culture around here. Bye, Dirk. No, it's the other place. It's a place that is detestable to God. There are things in the Hebrew Bible that talk about how bad the Moabites are. And so to go to Moab is to go about as far away from God as you possibly can get. And so that's where she goes. Next slide, please. And there, she and her husband have a couple of boys. Those boys grow up and marry Moabite women. So not only does God not favor them because of a famine, not only do they go where God is not, but their kids are likely going to then have more kids. Her grandkids are going to be cut out from the assembly of the Lord, from the people of God for generations. The whole thing sets us up to see a story of Naomi and Ruth as being outsiders. Beyond that, they are women. I'm sorry, that's not politically correct today to say, well, they're women, they're on the outside. But in that culture, women only got their identity through the man that they were attached to. Their husband, their father, even their sons. If you were not attached to a man in some way, you had no way to support yourself, no way to plug into society, no stature, none of that. So once Naomi's and Ruth's husbands die, they have no place in society. They are in the cracks. They're in the margins. They don't have a place to be. They're as far outside as you can get. Next slide. And then last week, we see before or after all that stuff happens, we see Naomi saying, you know what, there's nothing for me here. My husband died, my sons died, I'm going back to Bethlehem. And Ruth says, no, I'm going with you. Ruth says, where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. It's a moment of what we understood and we heard from Keith time and time again last week, a moment of chesed. See, I tried to do that with the throat thing. Chesed. Did I get it? That good? I didn't spit anything up, though. Yeah. It's a moment of chesed. It's what Ruth does, if you will, for Naomi, but it's also what God does for us. There is nowhere we can go where God will not be there. There's nowhere you can go where God will not be there. You cannot run fast enough to run away from God, and that is a Hesed kind of God. And that leads us to chapter 2, which is the text that we're in today. Next slide, please. And it starts out with this concept of gleaning and gathering. Naomi and Ruth, they go back to Bethlehem. They go to a field that is owned by a man named Boaz. And Boaz, it says, is part of her former husband's family, much broader family. It's not like his first cousin or something, but it's part of the broad family of Elimelech. And so they basically say, let's go over there and let's glean and gather. Now, what is gleaning and gathering? To put it simply, it's required by the Torah to allow people to do. It's ancient welfare. See, my father-in-law worked at Hormel for 38 years, and so he started as a hog buyer, and he ended up in the corporate offices. Great career, but every time I'd be at their house for dinner, he would come home and give some sort of disgusting story on what part of the pig they sold. Because at Hormel, like a lot of companies, you waste nothing. There's no part of the pig that didn't get sold for profit. Nothing. You couldn't think of anything on the pig that was not sold somewhere in the world for profit. Simply put, that was illegal and is illegal according to Torah law. As you harvest a field, you are required to not use all of it, not harvest all of it, but leave a significant portion of it behind. You're not allowed to harvest the corners of the field. If you are harvesting and you drop some, you have to leave it there. If you miss some as you go on past, you can't go back and get it. You have to leave it there. Why? Because there are poor, starving outsiders who need to get food. And those are the gleaners and gatherers. You are required to leave something behind for those who don't have anything to eat. You are required not just to leave something behind, but a lot to eat. There was a lot of energy and a lot of people that would take a lot of time to go through these fields and gather enough to eat. That is the situation Naomi and Ruth are in. They are gleaners and gatherers. And if you look at the text, they are not the first tier of gleaners and gatherers. They are not even the servant women who are the second tier, but Ruth gets to go after all of them, reinforcing the idea of how outside Ruth is as a Moabite woman. She can get something because that's what Torah law requires, but she's getting it last. Now, there are a couple of ways to read this entire chapter, and I encourage you over your devotional time this week to read this whole chapter, not just the 9 verses or so that I gave you, but read the whole chapter and ask yourself, what is Ruth's role in this entire chapter? Because I think there are 2 ways to read this text, by the way. One of them is what I would call a traditional reading. Next slide, please. And everything is pretty basic, pretty straightforward. You start at the beginning of the chapter, and you see that Naomi's relative is Boaz. That's the owner of the field. The next verse, you see that Ruth goes to glean from the harvest because that's her place in society, outsider. And then she's working in the field of Boaz. And then comes Boaz, who says, who does that woman belong to? And the rest of the chapter reads in these 2 ways. The traditional one is showing, we read Boaz as a pretty righteous man who supplies and takes care of those who are in need. And I could easily preach a sermon that says, well, shouldn't we do that too? Shouldn't we take care of those that are in need? Shouldn't we look out for those? And that is a very valid sermon. That's definitely in the text. But there's also a very non-traditional way to read this that I think is kind of swept under the rug, so to speak. It talks about attributes that we in our normal Christian society and good company generally don't lift up as good things, but things that we sweep under the rug. Let's see if we can unpack it this way. Next slide, please. All right. I want you to be completely honest with me because I'm going to do a show of hands test. There's 2 ways to see what's going on in this picture. One of them is this, that you think that she just got a ticket. And the other one is that she got away with a warning. So by show of hands, how many of you think that she actually got a ticket? How many of you think she got away with a warning? Okay, there's a few of you. I'm surprised, by the way. I've used this before. You are very much like the 815 group, so the balance was completely off. I would be a person that when I see this, I look and say, you know what, $20 says she got off with a warning. Because this is what I would bet happened. Please, officer? Please, officer, can I, it was just once, I was speeding, but can I just get a warning on this one? Do I have to get a ticket? A lot of people answer that question with warning because there is a stereotype. There is a cultural stereotype because she's blonde, maybe cute, and that she's a female, that she can simply bat her eyes and get done whatever she wants to get done. Most people say, that I've asked, except for this group, that thanks for blowing it all out of the water, right? Let's say that she got a warning. And then what would we say about that person who bats their eyes and, looks in that way at the cop just to get out? We probably wouldn't have the best of words for that person. We'd probably roll our eyes ourselves and say, well, that's not fair. That's not what's supposed to happen. She should get what's coming to her, but she got out of it. I kind of think that second option has more to do with what Ruth is doing in this text than the first one. Read it this way. Next slide. So in chapter 2, verse 5, Boaz asked the foreman of his harvesters. The text says, whose young woman is that? But what's a little more accurate with the Greek word that's there is, whose young woman of marriageable age is that? Whose unwed woman is that? That's the question. The question isn't just whose is that, or to what man does that woman belong, but clearly that woman isn't married, right? Does she belong to anybody? Trust me, when you read Ruth, it's there. And then you continue on, and it says this, please, Boaz, let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters. And then he says, next slide, I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. I told them not to hurt you, not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you are thirsty, go ahead and get a drink from the water jars that the men have filled. Not the ones that the rest of the women are going to go drink from, but you get to go drink from the bigger jars, from the ones that the men have filled, because there is a class system going on here. And unfortunately, the reality is women have a lower status than men. So for Boaz to protect her, when she is a Moabite, she's not Jewish, she's not Hebrew, she doesn't have any standing. For him to, as I'm saying, bat her eyes, and for him to step up and protect her, and not only that, but move her up past all these other Hebrew people and say, oh, you can have the good water too, says something about what is going on in this text. And I think it says something about realities of life that we often sweep under the rug. It also continues and says, she says, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you would notice me, a foreigner? I mean, you can kind of hear, why have I found such favor in your eyes? Why? What is it about me that has found such favor in your eyes? And then she says, may I continue to find favor in your eyes? You have given me comfort and have spoken kindly to your servant, though I do not have the strong standing of one of your servant girls. But yet you are doing all of this for me, as if, what on earth would you want in return from me, Boaz? Next slide, please. So I think that there are social norms and social realities that put a lens on how we view what's really going on in Scripture. Another one of my favorite movies, Pleasantville. Great movie. You need to watch it 15 times to see all the different layers that's going on in there, right? But it's really interesting because in this movie you see very clearly, as well as a lot of TV shows from the era, right? You see the very clearly defined roles that men and women are supposed to play in society. If you remember the scene, if you've seen this, the husband, played by William H. Macy, comes home, he hangs up his hat, he hangs up his coat, and he says, honey, I'm home. And what's the expectation for her? Anyone know? Just guess? Dinner would be ready. You'd take the briefcase and bring it to the office. You could sit down, she'd bring you a drink, right? I'm not saying that's the way it really was, but there certainly were stereotypes. There certainly were social roles that people had to play, and that is exactly the same kind of thing that's going on in Ruth. Ruth, as a female, specifically a Moabite female, had a role to play in society. She was supposed to fit in a certain box and play a certain role, and something happened that was different that caused her to jump over all kinds of other statuses in society and get special favor in the eyes of Boaz. And like I said about the person in the getting the ticket with the police officer, our culture doesn't always have a good name for that person. That woman who uses what she's got to go after a man that could give her and her family what she wants. Because that's all she was doing, right? Said another way, Ruth was not playing the role that a woman should have played. She was assertive. She was strategic. She was smart. She was taking care of her family, Naomi. And she was doing what she had to do to survive. And yet often we read this as something completely different, that the righteous person, the one who is going the extra mile, is Boaz. And I think that it's actually the opposite. I think the strong character in this story is Ruth. I think Ruth is the one who is using all that God has given her, her smarts, her ability to strategize, and her assertiveness to lift up her family. But often we sweep that under the rug. Now, I think you should have been handed, everyone should have been handed one of those devotional cards. Can you grab that for a second? And if you don't, if you could raise your hand and we can have one of the ushers. But if you look on the back, you need about 3 up on your right. If you look on the back, there are some lines. And you can do this now or you can do this over the week or both. But if you have a pen or a pencil, one in front of you or whatever, I encourage you to write down in those lines what are the aspects or the attributes or parts of your character that you downplay because it's just not acceptable or people don't seem to read that right. I think that we sweep the assertiveness and the aggressiveness and the strategy of Ruth under the table and we favor Boaz. And I think each of us does that in our own way as well. But beyond that, what else do we sweep under the rug that we don't want the world to see? Next slide, please. What do you have, or what parts of you do you ignore and cover up? What actions have you taken in the past that other people might look down upon, therefore you're not very proud about? What about yourself are you simply not honest about? That's a list that's going to take a while to write up because you can add to it and get a little more serious with it and say, what are the things that you really aren't proud about? In what ways have you hurt other people? And you, of course, aren't telling other people. You're sweeping that. How have you damaged others? How have you broken relationships? How have you hurt others? But everything from the realities of who Ruth is that we sweep under the table, who we are created to be and we sweep under the rug, and even those things that we're not proud of that we ignore, as you write that down, the second question is this. Next slide. Is there anything on that list that's news to God? Is there anything on that list that is news to God? Next slide. And lastly, does God feel, if that's the right word, does God feel any differently, treat you any differently about you now that these things are on the table? For me, when I read Ruth, I am shocked at how much I personally disregard who Ruth really was. And how God used her, not Boaz, her, to tell a story that we're going to see unfold through the rest of Lent and all the way up to Easter. An assertive, smart individual who was an outsider in every way, even in the way that she acted. And yet God is using the whole of her, all of her. Just like those kids accepted the whole of who that supervillain was, no matter what. God accepts the whole of who you are as well. There's nothing to hide. There's nothing to sweep under the rug, and there's nothing that God would push away and say that's not part of who I'm going to accept. We're going to take this part and not the rest. No, that's not the way God operates. That's all of who you are. Today. Every day. Let us pray. Creator God, as we journey through the rest of Lent, help us own up to who it is you have created us to be, as well as the ways in which we've harmed your kingdom, your creation, through broken relationships. Help us as we discern and pray and meditate on who you are in our lives and in this world, that we also bring before you all of who we are created to be, all of what we have done. Not just so you could self-examine and pick and choose and point at certain things as saying right and wrong and good and bad, so we can be honest with ourselves as to who we are in your world. We can be honest with ourselves about who we've hurt. We can be honest with ourselves about the strengths and gifts that you've given us. So we can be honest about how we are using all of who we're created to be to usher in heaven on earth. Help us take a close look at all the things that we sweep under the rug just so that we can be socially acceptable. In your name we pray. Amen.